The year is 1603. England stands at a crossroads. Queen Elizabeth I, the legendary Virgin Queen, has breathed her last. Power now shifts to King James VI of Scotland and First of England, a shy, neurotic man of keen intellect and openly homoerotic predilections. In the flamboyant world of the Renaissance court, the king's closest companions, called courtiers, held immense sway. These favorites could influence policy, amass wealth, and even become national figures. Unlike the preceding Elizabethan court, which focused on the selection of seasoned advisors and the implementation of strategic alliances, the court of James I gave way to a system where personal connections held more sway than alliance agreements or political experience. Under James, the term favorite took on new connotations when courtiers were chosen specifically because James found them physically attractive. While the king continued to promote some of his courtiers and ministers in the usual fashion, the selection of his inner circle became centered around personal loyalty and a kind of favoritism that went beyond the bounds of friendship into the realm of homosexual love. In this video, we will explore these relationships one by one, leading up to the most notorious of them all, that of the king's last, and some say, most dangerous of favorites, George Villiers. King James's personal life has been a subject of historical fascination and debate for centuries. Even though he was married to Anne of Denmark and fathered 7 children, contemporaries persisted in documenting a distinct preference for close male companions, something that academic history has largely glossed over when speaking of the Renaissance court. During his life, jokes and rumors about his homosexuality were common, largely due to how he surrounded himself with handsome young men whom he quite openly kissed, wrote about lovingly, and shared a bed with. King James also penned his own treatise on the evils of homosexuality in 1599, in which he classed sodomy with witchcraft as an unforgivable crime, along with murder. One can only assume that it took some level of hypocrisy, or perhaps cognitive dissonance, for him to reconcile this point of view with his own desires. However, he probably just chose to believe that the rules did not apply to him, since it was largely held to be true that the king could do no wrong. Prior to his ascension to the English throne, King James had already established an attraction to and a pattern of relying on close male companions. In 1603, when he succeeded Elizabeth I to become James I of England, when the Queen died without a direct heir, his court was already packed with Scottish courtiers, and this was particularly noticeable in the bedchamber. The bedchamber was the true inner sanctum of royal life, a place where only a select few courtiers were permitted. It was a highly coveted space for those seeking advancement at court. King James's first significant relationship with a male companion began in his youth. In 1579, when James was only 13, the first cousin of his father, Lord Darnley, arrived in Scotland from France. His name was Esme Stuart, a dashing Catholic nobleman who would play a major role in James's emotional and political life. At 37 years old, a much older married man with his own children, Esme Stuart was known for his charm and sophistication. He wasted no time in forming a close bond with the young monarch, becoming James's confidant, advisor, and even a surrogate father figure. James was so enamored of Stuart that he showered him with gifts and titles. In 1581, James bestowed upon Stuart the title Duke of Lennox, the only Duke of Scotland at the time and a highly prestigious honor. According to custom, after inheriting the Duchy of Lennox, Stuart became known as Lord Lennox, or simply Lennox, as the king chose to affectionately call him. James loved Lennox so much that he even gave the newly appointed lord jewels from the collection of his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots. Some historians think that James's need for a close male favorite came from a lack of family, while growing up in Scotland, where he became King of Scots at 13 months old, upon the abdication of his Catholic mother under the Protestant rule of Queen Elizabeth I. His early years were marked by instability and a power struggle between Protestant nobles who sought to control the young king and shape his upbringing. This religious tension created a vacuum in the royal court, lacking a strong figure to guide James. During the period referred to as the Lennox regime, the king's favorite used his influence and connections to the French court to help the young James VI assert his authority in the Scottish court and gradually reduce the power of the Protestant lords who had James under their thumb. For this, as you might imagine, the young king was open-heartedly grateful. The public displays of affection between James and Lennox were documented and viewed as unusually intimate by contemporaries. Letters exchanged between the two expressed strong emotions and devotion, with some interpreting the language as suggestive of a physical relationship. A poem penned by a teenage James titled Phoenix featured a beautiful bird symbolizing a foreign lover, further fueling speculation about the nature of their bond. Historians continue to debate the exact nature of the relationship between the young King James and Lennox, and while the term homosexual affair in the modern sense might be disputed, the evidence suggests a very close relationship that could have been sexual in nature. It could even be said, by modern standards, that Lennox's influence over the young king was a form of grooming designed to foster James's reliance on the elder courtier. Regardless of the specific nature of their relationship, Lennox's growing influence continued to threaten the Protestant nobles in the Scottish court. In 1582, whispers of the more intimate nature surrounding their relationship, along with the perceived threat of Catholic influence by Lennox, led to the occurrence of a traumatic event for James. On August 23rd, while King James was on a hunting expedition near Ruthven Castle, a faction of the disgruntled Scottish nobles, known as the Lords Enterprisers, seized him in a surprise maneuver. Their primary goal was to break Lennox's hold over the king as well as another of the king's supporters, James Stuart, 1st Earl of Arran. This daring act highlighted the young monarch's vulnerability and the fractured nature of Scottish politics. James, then only 16 years old, was said to have cried when abducted. He must have felt a sense of powerlessness during his capture, shattering any semblance of security he had attained with Lennox by his side. The Enterprisers presented James with a supplication, a document outlining their grievances that justified their actions and the measures they demanded for the king to be able to return to court. By holding the king captive, they effectively sidelined Lennox, along with any other of the king's favorites, thereby barring any contact for the next 10 months. This period of captivity was a harsh trial of endurance for James. He was forced to confront the realities of power struggles amidst the treacherous waters of court politics. For a period of 10 months, James remained under the control and confinement of the Ruthven lords. During this time, he was relocated to various residences while failed attempts took place to free him. Sadly, under duress, James was forced to agree to exile Lennox from Scotland. Soon after, he managed to escape his captivity by the Ruthven lords on June 27, 1583, but the damage had been done. He would never see Lennox again, but the bond between them remained strong, as evidenced by their ongoing clandestine correspondence. Following Lennox's death in Paris, May of 1583, a poignant symbol of their connection emerged when Lennox's embalmed heart was carried back to James in Scotland by a cohort of Lennoxes from his days at the Scottish court. Five years after the banishment of Lennox from the Scottish court, and pressed to produce an heir to the throne, James married Anne of Denmark in 1589. He fathered 7 children with Queen Anne, and though their relationship was never a great romance, he retained a fondness for her until her death in 1619. Regardless, it was evident that James lacked a close emotional or intellectual connection with his queen, and in general, held a low opinion of women, a sentiment not uncommon in a misogynistic era. As James VI succeeded to the English throne in 1603, becoming both James I of England and James VI of Scotland, a new chapter began not just for England under the Union of the Crowns, but also for the dynamics of court life. James brought with him from Scotland a substantiated system of promoting close male companions, those upon whom he relied for love and affection, his courtiers. Based on personal connection rather than established nobility, James saw advantages in these relationships. He believed that his favorites, with less established power bases, would be more loyal and dependent on him while being showered with titles and given positions of power and influence. Two such men began their ascent upon the king's arrival in the English court, Sir James Hay and Philip Herbert, Earl of Montgomery. James Hay was of Scottish descent and had, upon meeting the new English king, impressed James by his education and refinement acquired through studies in France. He was of a contingent of wealthy families in both Scotland and England who would send their sons abroad for education, with France being a popular choice. As we will see later, this practice of sending sons to France to acquire education, culture, and refinement also played a role in the rise of George Villiers to become one of the most noted of King James's favorites. In 1603, James Hay was knighted by King James either when James was James VI of Scotland or shortly after he became James I of England. Historians are not agreed upon how and when they first met. Either way, he was soon treated as a prime favorite and made a gentleman of the bedchamber. In 1604, Hay was tasked with delivering a message to Henry IV of France. This message included a request for the French king to intercede on behalf of the Huguenots and pressure the Catholic French government to ease their persecution. But Hay was a young and inexperienced diplomat who only succeeded in annoying the French king. As a sign of displeasure, Henry IV, who saw Hay's overtly forceful advocacy as meddling in France's internal affairs, reduced the customary gifts presented to the English envoy as a symbolic way of expressing his disapproval. Nevertheless, Hay remained in favor in the English court, and in June of 1606, King James issued a formal document known as a patent, elevating James Hay to the rank of baron. It was a lifelong title, not hereditary but without a place or voice in Parliament, no doubt to render Hay's advancement less unpalatable to the English lords. The king bestowed on Hay numerous grants, paid his debts, and secured for him a rich bride in the person of Honora Denny, only daughter and heir of Edward Lord Denny. The marriage was celebrated by an elaborate masque. A masque was a type of festive entertainment in 16th and early 17th century Europe, known for their lavish costumes and elaborate set designs intending to create a visually stunning spectacle accompanied by music, dancing, singing, and even staged dramatic scenes. As a prime favorite of King James, Hay attained such titles as Knight of the Bath, Knight of the Order of the Garter, Lord Hay of Sawley, Baron for Life, Viscount Doncaster, and Earl of Carlisle, along with securing the positions of Master of the Wardrobe, Gentleman of the Bedchamber, and Privy Councillor. He was sent abroad again as diplomat and ambassador, but without much success along those lines. When King James died, Hay remained at court and was appointed Gentleman of the Bedchamber to James's son, King Charles I. But as time went on, he found that his value was diminished to the point where he retired from public life and died in March 1636. During the same time period, another of James's courtiers was Philip Herbert, Earl of Montgomery. In 1600, the 16-year-old Herbert, being the son of the second Earl of Pembroke, made his first appearance at court. 3 years later, on James's succession to the English throne in 1603, Herbert caught the king's eye at the youthful age of 19. Herbert's major interests at the time were hunting and hawking, and it was in these fields that he first drew the king's attention, setting the stage to cultivate a close relationship with James that would bring him wealth, titles, and positions in the royal court. In May, James quickly established Herbert as a favorite by making him a gentleman of the Privy Chamber. By July, he was knighted into the Order of the Bath, so called because the ceremony of the knighthood included a ritual bath symbolic of spiritual purification. We don't know if Herbert was inducted with this ritual, but it is readily assumed that he and James had a sexual relationship around this time. James would have been 37 or 38 years old to Herbert's 19. Just like James Hay, Philip Herbert acquired a litany of titles and positions received from James I, including the first Earl of Montgomery within only 2 years in 1605. By 1624, he was made Lord Lieutenant of Kent and member of the Privy Council. Herbert's relationship with James remained strong throughout the king's reign, even in light of Herbert's gambling debts which the king paid. James even intervened to reconcile Herbert with another courtier after a violent quarrel. Herbert was to become notorious for his violent assaults against his contemporaries, which were usually unprovoked, but he was invariably forgiven by the king. Also, just like James Hay, Herbert continued to receive royal favor, maintaining his positions and titles after James's son, Charles I, inherited the throne in 1625. Philip Herbert, 1st Earl of Montgomery, died in May 1649, just 3 months after the execution of King Charles I. As we have seen so far, James considered it perfectly acceptable to pay off the debts of Herbert and Hay using his own revenue, money he could ill afford to spend, as the king was a spendthrift whose own pile of debts kept mounting year after year. Nor did James have any qualms about granting titles and political positions to his Scottish favorites, such as Hay and another Scottish courtier we have yet to mention, John Ramsay. Ramsay was a lowly-born Scot, knighted by James in 1600, and created Viscount of Haddington and Lord Ramsay of Barnes in the Scottish peerage in 1606, and Lord Ramsay of Melrose in 1609, among various other offices that he acquired during his court career. James also paid off Ramsay's debts, arranged his marriage to a daughter of the Earl of Sussex, and granted him various English lands from which the Scot would garner income. All of this was creating antagonism in the English royal court, coupled with an ever-growing paranoia of royal favoritism of the Scots. And to make matters worse, James was becoming increasingly demonstrative in his affections towards his favorites, something that would escalate upon the arrival of a new Scottish courtier to the royal court. Robert Carr was born in 1587. His parents were Scots, using the Scottish pronunciation of Kerr, but in the English royal court he was known as Robert Carr, and then was referenced as Somerset when King James I awarded him the title of 1st Earl of Somerset in 1613. Like other young men of his era seeking advancement, Carr spent time in France to learn languages, refined manners, and to gain exposure to court culture. Sir John Harrington, a well-known English nobleman, writer, and courtier at the court of King James at the same time as Carr, described him as straight-limbed, well-favored, strong-shouldered, and smooth-faced. In 1601, Carr was 14 years old and an obscure page to a Scottish nobleman when he met Thomas Overbury in Edinburgh. Overbury was an Englishman 6 years Carr's senior, who had already found favor with Robert Cecil, 1st Earl of Salisbury, for his accomplished mind and good manners. Carr and Overbury became intimate friends, and most likely lovers, while they traveled to London together. Overbury soon became Carr's secretary. When Carr embarked on his career at court, Overbury became mentor, secretary, and political advisor to the increasingly charismatic Carr. In truth, it was Overbury that was the brains behind Carr's steady rise to prominence once the young and handsome Scotsman had attracted the attention of King James. Accompanied by Overbury, Robert Carr reached the English royal court in 1607. At that time, Carr was in attendance to a fellow Scotsman, Sir James Hay, at a tournament. During the tournament, Carr was thrown by his horse and suffered a broken leg. King James took notice of the handsome young man and insisted that he be cared for by the royal physicians. From that point forward, the king took a personal interest in Carr's recuperation. He visited him frequently and quickly became infatuated with the young man. He began teaching his protégé Latin and spending a significant amount of time with him. Upon Carr's recovery, James appointed him as a gentleman of the bedchamber and openly demonstrated his affection for Carr. James strolled around the court, leaning on the younger man's arm, making no effort to hide that Carr was now his personal favorite. Over the next 3 years, Carr was showered with grants and favors. But not everyone at court was happy about this new courtier. The king's wife, Queen Anne, and his firstborn son and heir apparent, Prince Henry, both took a dislike to Carr. Henry was against his father's love of men, largely due to his deeply held Protestant religious beliefs against homosexuality, as well as the fact that James devoted his entire attention to Carr, saying he loved him above all men living. Regardless, Prince Henry's disapproval of James's affection towards Carr was silenced when Henry died suddenly at the age of 18 in November of 1612. It was a devastating personal blow to both James and Anne. Yet the memory of his son's disapproval did nothing to diminish James's affection for Carr. By 1610, Parliament had begun showing signs of attacking the king's Scottish favourites, including Robert Carr. But Carr knew how to exploit the king's weaknesses and used his influence to persuade the king to dissolve Parliament. His influence increased even more over the course of the next few years when he was advanced as a Privy Councillor, then First Earl of Somerset, as well as appointed Treasurer of Scotland. In 1612, upon the death of the then Secretary of State Robert Cecil, James had the notion of governing in person as his own Chief Minister of State. He then assigned Carr to carry out many of Salisbury's former duties and act as the king's secretary. And while Carr relished the power of such a role assigned to him, he was well aware that he was hardly experienced for the responsibilities thrust upon him, and feared that his rivals would use any failure to weaken his position with the king. To guard against this, Carr turned to his intimate friend Overbury, who was more adept at administrative tasks than himself, and eager to reinstate his role as Carr's secretary, confidant, and advisor. Upon James' precipitous decision to govern his country without a parliament and without a skilled Secretary of State, a confluence of events occurred that set the stage for Carr's downfall. Firstly, Carr's close alliance with Overbury took a turn for the worse when Overbury was imprisoned by the king, which will be explained shortly. Secondly, James's decision created a vacuum whereby factions formed within the government. Noblemen such as Thomas Howard, 1st Earl of Suffolk, and various members of the Howard family, along with other noble families, took control of much of the government and its patronage. By working together, they were able to form alliances with other influential figures to strategically position themselves for key appointments and determine who received favors and positions of power within the government. Thirdly, Carr met and fell in love with the Earl of Suffolk's daughter, Frances Howard, who was already married but able to secure an annulment through the power of her family. Carr and Frances sought to get married, but Overbury objected in an effort to try and prevent the marriage, citing mistrust of the Howards. In order to remove him from court, the Howard faction manipulated Overbury into a precarious position with the king. They persuaded the king to offer Overbury an assignment as ambassador to the court of Tsar Michael of Russia, aware that his refusal would be tantamount to treason. The plan worked and Overbury declined, wishing to remain in England and at his friend's side. On April 22, 1613, Overbury was placed in the Tower of London at the king's behest. Afraid for his life, Overbury initiated a series of communications with Carr, urging him to secure his release. Over a period of 5 months, as his desperation grew, Overbury's messages became more menacing. He hinted to Carr that it would be wise to secure his freedom before he could divulge to the king all the secrets Carr had confided to him during the 8 years of their intimate relationship. Seemingly, the threats dissipated when on September 15th of the same year, Overbury died under the assumption of what were considered at that time natural causes. Robert and Frances were married on December 26, 1613, and in 1614, Carr was awarded another title, that of Lord Chamberlain. But King James's interest in his courtier was beginning to wane. He had discovered that Carr had not been a faithful companion, having been intimate with Overbury over the years, along with a few other dalliances with other courtiers. Also in 1614, a new, young, charming, and exceedingly handsome, by all accounts, courtier was about to take center stage with King James. The arrival of this new competitor for the king's affections prompted James to write a letter addressed to Carr, detailing a list of complaints he had against him. The specific complaints James listed in the letter are not entirely clear, However, historians believe they likely centered around Carr's lack of political experience and his reliance on others for guidance, as well as the king's disappointment in Carr's involvement with the Howards and the overall messiness of his wife's annulment scandal. Still, Carr retained some favor and might possibly have remained in power for some time longer, but for the discovery in July 1615 of the murder of Overbury by poisoning. An inquiry into Overbury's death revealed that he did not die from natural causes but had been poisoned. Carr's wife, Frances Howard, was swiftly identified as the murderess, seemingly based upon a deep-seated hatred for Overbury, who had once called her a base woman when he objected to her marriage to Carr. Despite indications that Carr was unaware of his wife's plot to poison Overbury, his connections to both victim and murderer inevitably implicated him, and even while he asserted his innocence to all that would listen, Carr's fall from favor was swift and complete. King James also believed that Carr was involved and wrote him letters, urging him to confess his guilt. James's motivations likely stemmed not from concern for Carr, but from a desire to avoid implication himself. After all, it was James who had initially ordered Overbury's imprisonment, and he likely wished to distance himself from the scandal. During Carr's trial, the king's letters were used as evidence, indicating at the very least neglect of duty and abuse of the king's trust, if not outright murder. Even if Carr had been cleared of direct involvement in the poisoning, the evidence against him would have been enough to ruin him. Ultimately, Carr was found guilty, though his charges were later reduced to being an accessory after the fact rather than a direct participant in the crime. He, Francis, and 4 others recruited by Francis were sentenced to death, but James commuted Carr and Francis's sentences to imprisonment in the Tower, which lasted 7 years. Carr adamantly refused to admit to any involvement. In 1622, the couple were released from prison to retire to their estate. In 1624, Carr received a pardon. During this time, Carr and James exchanged numerous letters, but their relationship was irreparably damaged. They are said to have met for one final farewell, but thereafter they never contacted or saw each other again. Carr and his wife lived more or less in obscurity until Carr's death in 1645. And then there was George Villiers, the new favorite who first caught the king's eye in 1614. Just as Overbury served as a coach and mentor to Robert Carr, aiding in his success in winning the king's affection, George Villiers also had a similar guide. However, in George's case, it was his mother, Mary Villiers. Mary Villiers was born in 1570, the daughter of Anthony Beaumont of Glenfield, Leicestershire. She belonged to minor nobility, tracing her lineage back to Henry de Beaumont, who was acknowledged as an earl in right of his wife in 1310. This title was acquired through his marriage to Alice Comyn, Countess of Buchan, who was the niece and heir of John Comyn, Earl of Buchan. Nevertheless, Mary's family was not a family of means, which fueled a determination to marry strategically in order to gain money, status, and influence, a necessary socio-economic practice for women of early modern England. At that time period, women were constrained from exercising any personal agency, either by being barred from inheriting land, unless there were no sons, which limited their access to wealth and the power associated with land ownership, known as primogeniture, or through marriage according to the law of coverture. In 16th century England, when a woman married, her legal identity was absorbed by her husband. She couldn't own property independently, make contracts, or even sue in court without her husband's consent. Essentially, her spouse became her legal guardian. It was under these constraints that Mary Beaumont married several times, knowing that she had no access to money on her own other than what she was able to gain firstly as a widow, and secondly through her son George, who was able, later on, to provide her with both a title and wealth. Mary was in her late teens when she made her first marriage to her recently widowed cousin, Sir George Villiers, a country gentleman and English knight who was twice her age. Sir George had been married to Audrey Saunders, who died in 1587. They had 2 sons and 4 daughters. In about 1590, he married Mary Beaumont. They had 5 children, with the first named Samuel, who died in infancy, leaving 3 sons, John, George, and Christopher, and a daughter named Susan. In early 1606, Sir George Villiers died when his son George, who would go on to become King James I's most notorious of favorites, was 13. Sir George left his family in debt. Mary lived at Godeby with her children after Villiers' death, but married twice more. First on June 19, 1606, to 80-year-old Sir William Rayner of Orton, Peterborough, who died in November 1606 of that same year, and again around 1616 to Sir Thomas Compton, a younger son of Henry Compton, 1st Baron Compton. Although a member of an aristocratic family, as a younger son, Compton did not inherit the main family title or estates, which left Mary with yet another husband without any financial resources. Which brings us to her son, George. As George Villiers was approaching young adulthood, Mary turned to her second-born as the most likely of her sons to bring status and wealth to her and her family. Mary saw in George certain qualities that, if nurtured, could elevate his social status and, in turn, benefit her and her family. Knowing that King James favored handsome young men, and realizing that her son George was a likely candidate based on his appearance, Mary Villiers put into place a plan to send her son to the English court. Godfrey Goodman, who became the Bishop of Gloucester, described George at the time as the handsomest bodied man in England, his limbs so well compacted and his conversation so pleasing and of so sweet a disposition. Another observer, Sir Symonds D'Ewes, found him full of delicacy and handsome features. His hands and face seemed to me, especially, effeminate and curious. The first stage of the plan was for George to learn the ways of courtly behavior, and following in the footsteps of many of his predecessors, George was sent to the French court, where he learned the courtly skills, including fencing and dancing, and gained some fluency in the French language, all of which were essential for English high society. Upon his return to England, George Villiers approached the court of King James I in August 1614, where, at the age of 21, George captured the attention of the king during a hunt in Apithorpe. James was 47 and said to have been of middle stature, more corpulent through his clothes than his body, yet fat enough, his clothes ever being made large and easy, the doublets quilted for stiletto-proof, his breeches in pleats and full-stuffed. His eye was large, ever rolling after any stranger that came into his presence, in so much as many for shame have left the room, as being out of countenance. His legs were very weak, and that weakness made him ever leaning on other men's shoulders. His walk was ever circular, his fingers ever in that walk fiddling about his codpiece. Opponents of the king's then favored courtier Robert Carr, Earl of Somerset, saw this as an opportunity to supplant Carr and began advocating for George Villiers. Funds were raised by such men as the 3rd Earl of Pembroke and the then Archbishop of Canterbury George Abbot to outfit George with a new wardrobe. Vigorous lobbying by these men secured his appointment on April 23, 1615, as royal cupbearer. This was a prestigious and influential position, as his duty was not just to serve drinks to the monarch but to guard it in order to ensure it was safe from any insidious plot to poison the king. Thus, George immediately entered the court as a high-ranking and trustworthy figure able to enter the confidence of the king. In addition, he was able to engage with the king in conversation, which led to another ascendant position. George Villiers was immediately knighted the next day on the 24th of April. Soon after, George began appearing as a dancer in masques from 1615 onwards, using this platform to showcase his graceful movements and physical beauty in an effort to seduce King James. In September of that same year, with the accusation of murdering Overbury leveled against Robert Carr, Earl of Somerset, Somerset's downfall was sealed and George Villiers immediately stepped into the position of the king's prime favorite. Under the king's patronage, George advanced rapidly through the ranks of the nobility, and his court appointments grew in importance. On January 3, 1616, he became Master of the Horse. On April 24th, he received the Order of the Garter, and on August 27, 1616, George Villiers was created Viscount Villiers and Baron Wadden, receiving a grant of land valued at £80,000. On January 5, 1617, he was made Earl, and on January 1, 1618, Marquess of Buckingham, where he would henceforth be referred to as Buckingham. With the exception of the Earl of Pembroke, Buckingham was now the richest nobleman in England. Regardless, there were those in the royal court that thought that the speed at which Buckingham climbed the social ladder and was promoted was too much and too fast. The king's public displays of affection only further tarnished the court's reputation. James affectionately referred to George as "my sweetheart," "my sweet child and wife," and "my only sweet and dear child," and even gave him the nickname Steenie after Saint Stephen, who was said to have had the face of an angel. In 1617, James addressed the House of Lords in Parliament and drew a parallel between his own affection for Buckingham and the relationship that Jesus Christ had with his disciple John. He told the Lords, "I, James, am neither God nor an angel, but a man like any other. Therefore I act like a man and confess to loving those dear to me more than other men. You may be sure that I love the Earl of Buckingham more than anyone else, and more than you who are here assembled. I wish to speak in my own behalf, and not to have it thought to be a defect, for Jesus Christ did the same, and therefore I cannot be blamed. Christ had his John, and I have my George." Equally, Buckingham flattered the king at every opportunity. There is little doubt that Buckingham was well aware of his actions. He ended his letters to the king with "Your Majesty's most humble slave and dog," and that by catering to James, he was advancing his own position within the royal court and that of his family, as his mother intended. Buckingham strategically placed his supporters and family members in positions of authority, all the while enjoying the unwavering support of King James I. One of those involved in assisting him was the philosopher Francis Bacon, who, with Buckingham's favor, was given the role of Lord Chancellor. In response to securing his position, Bacon fulfilled Buckingham's requests of favors for his close allies and family. In time, however, an investigation launched by Parliament would uncover deep levels of corruption, with Bacon taking the blame, while Buckingham distanced himself from the man he once called a friend and mentor. Buckingham's immediate family, including his 2 brothers and 1 sister and his mother, all benefited by achieving wealth and status from his career as the king's most beloved courtier. Buckingham's older brother, George Villiers, was appointed a knight in 1616. He held the office of Groom of the Bedchamber and Master of the Robes to King James in that same year. On July 19, 1619, he was created 1st Baron Stoke of Buckingham and 1st Viscount Purbeck. Buckingham's younger brother, Christopher, also known at court as Kit Villiers, was ennobled as an earl, while his sister Susan would become a countess. Buckingham's mother, Mary Villiers, was elevated to the status of a Countess of Buckingham in her own right on July 1, 1618, a Marchioness in 1619, and a Duchess in 1623. With her status as Countess of Buckingham, Mary Villiers was prominent at court, yielding a great deal of power and influence. She was instrumental in advancing her children, including her eldest John, whose prospects were few due to a mental instability. Negotiations were initiated by Mary Villiers for John's marriage at the age of 26 to a wealthy heiress. The intended bride was Frances Coke, the 13-year-old daughter of Chief Justice of the King's Bench, Sir Edward Coke, by his second wife, Lady Hatton. Sir Edward Coke was required to give his consent and to provide a marriage portion of £10,000. However, he refused to pay more than 2/3 of that sum and was forced to resign from the bench. Despite Lady Hatton's strong opposition to the marriage, Sir Edward Coke eventually agreed to the marriage in order to regain his position. According to a 1909 publication entitled The Curious Case of Lady Purbeck, a scandal of the 17th century by historian-author Thomas Longville, Lady Hatton attempted to hide her daughter away in order to secure her marriage to Henry de Vere, 18th Earl of Oxford. But Sir Edward Coke discovered his daughter by chance at a house near Oatlands rented by Sir Edmund Withapole, and took her away with him. With his legal rights as patriarch of the family, he had her kept at the houses of various colleagues and relatives. The 1909 publication claims that Frances was tied to the bedpost and severely whipped into consent. In September 1617, she was married to George Villiers at Hampton Court, with King James giving away the bride, as she openly cried throughout the ceremony. John Villiers was granted the titles of Baron Villiers of Stoke and Viscount Purbeck of Dorset on July 19, 1619, largely as compensation for Lady Hatton's continued objection to the marriage and subsequent refusal to honor her daughter's dowry and transfer her Dorset property to Buckingham. The marriage between John Villiers and Frances Coke proved to be disastrous, largely due to John's mental instability. By 1620, he had completely lost his sanity, and shortly after, Frances is said to have started an illicit affair with Robert Howard, son of Thomas Howard, Earl of Suffolk. In October 1624, Frances gave birth to a son who was baptized as Robert Wright, with the prevailing assumption that the child was Robert Howard's. In January 1625, King James signed a warrant for the trial of Frances and Robert Howard, citing adultery. However, as the biographer Longville points out, the prosecution of Lady Purbeck was pretty clearly at the instigation of the Duke of Buckingham, for it seems that the Duke had become obsessed with his sister-in-law's behavior, and appears to have accused her not only of adultery, but also of witchcraft. In February 1625, he urged the Lord Chief Justice to imprison both her and Robert Howard. Howard was confined in the Fleet Prison and Frances put under house arrest at the home of a London alderman. In March 1625, Howard was publicly excommunicated after he refused to answer to the charge against him, and the proceedings were suspended. The trial resumed in November 1627 under Bishop George Montaigne, and Frances was convicted of lacking sexual restraint and adultery. Frances failed to perform her penance of standing barefoot in a white sheet in church while pronouncing her guilt, and was again put under house arrest. She escaped by disguising herself as a page boy, and fled from London to France, where she lived in exile in Paris for several years with her son. She converted to Roman Catholicism and lodged for a time in a convent, although she did not become a nun. She and Howard were reunited in France and returned to England during the reign of Charles I to petition the House of Lords in 1640 for the return of her £10,000 marriage payment, which had been appropriated by the Villiers family, but the petition was unsuccessful. The couple lived together in poverty, ever denied her family's money until Frances died in Oxford on June 4, 1645. As for John Villiers, he married again and died in 1658 without children of his own to pass on his rank of nobility. Mary Villiers' other son, Christopher, who was created first Earl of Anglesey and Baron Villiers of Daventry in 1623, and described as unattractive and unintelligent, also managed to become wealthy by his brother's machinations. Not only was he granted an annuity of £200 by the court, he also gained more wealth in a roundabout manner. In December 1617, Sir Robert Naunton, a middle-aged man with no sons, was appointed as Secretary of State on the condition of making Christopher Villiers his heir, and as a result, during his lifetime, Villiers gained from Naunton's estates, yielding £500 a year. He also had a substantial income from the patent for alehouses. In connection with that, he was accused in Parliament of malpractice, but the charges were abandoned. If he had had greater abilities, Christopher Villiers might have hoped to gain more important positions under the crown, but he was known to have a great fondness for alcohol, and in 1625, shortly after the death of James I, he disappeared from the royal court, with the rumor going about that King Charles I refused to have him in court because of his drunkenness. As for Buckingham's sister Susan, she would become Countess of Denbigh. In about 1607, she married Sir William Fielding, who Buckingham engineered into the role of Master of the King's Wardrobe, and was later created Earl of Denbigh. The Countess of Denbigh was often at court, and it has been said that she rode out hunting on occasion with King James. In 1626, she was appointed First Lady of the Bedchamber to Queen Henrietta Maria, Charles I's wife, and kept this office for the rest of her life. In 1644, the Queen was compelled to seek refuge in France as a result of the First English Civil War, and Susan accompanied her as a member of the Queen's household. While in France with the Queen, Susan converted to Roman Catholicism, and in 1651, the English Council of State ordered the sequestration of all her property in England on the grounds that she had become papist and said to be active in designs against the state. She died in France in 1652. Wealth and status were such important issues for the Villiers family that it was always on the mind of the family matriarch, Countess of Buckingham. At the time of John's marriage to Frances Coke in 1620, Buckingham was yet to be married. Over the years, George had gained incredible wealth as the king's favorite, but with no children, his brother John was deemed the heir to the ever-increasing Villiers family fortune. It was therefore time for George to secure a wife and produce an heir to secure the family's legacy and preserve its wealth. Catherine Manners was selected by the formidably ambitious Countess of Buckingham to marry her son George. She was the wealthiest woman in England outside the royal family. Lacking a brother, Catherine was the sole heiress to the estate of her father, Francis Manners, 6th Earl of Rutland. In an unexpected move, King James refused to allow Buckingham to marry her, almost the only occasion when he did not give the Villiers family whatever they asked for. He did this because Catherine was a strict Roman Catholic, and he felt it was not appropriate in light of the country's Protestant faith and policies. In addition to this, the Earl of Rutland refused to accept the Countess of Buckingham's demands for his daughter's dowry. To add fuel to the fire, Catherine converted to Protestantism to satisfy the Villiers family, which almost caused her father to call off the marriage. But Mary Villiers was not to be deterred. In a cunning, if not manipulative and scandalous move, the Countess invited Catherine to one of her residences for a late dinner where Catherine was forced to spend the night due to an unexplained attack of illness. That same night, Buckingham unexpectedly appeared on the premises, resulting in the two of them spending the night under the same roof, with only Mary as a chaperone. Believing his daughter's honor to be compromised, the Earl of Rutland refused to receive her back and demanded that George Villiers marry her immediately. At first, George refused to marry her, but the marriage did take place a few weeks later, on May 16, 1620. It is said that Catherine Manners, Duchess of Buckingham, was one of the few women of rank of the time whose gentleness and womanly tenderness, devotion, and purity of life were conspicuous in the midst of the almost universal corruption and immorality of the court. King James embraced Catherine as one of his own family, seeing her as a daughter, even though she returned to her own faith soon after her marriage. And though she was to be Buckingham's most loyal companion, the king never considered her a rival for George's affection and passions. It was no doubt reassuring when George used his influx of wealth from the marriage to buy and renovate an estate which had once been his and James's secret romantic getaway, and now would be again. Despite his relationship with the king, Catherine and George consummated the marriage and would go on to have 4 children together: Mary, Charles, George, and Francis. The 4 would be raised in the royal nursery alongside the royal family, and the families would be almost indistinguishable from each other in the turbulent years that followed James's reign. But whatever their feelings toward each other, the marriage had done exactly what Mary had planned. The Villiers line was secure through a legitimate heir, and the legacy would continue. As the years advanced, Buckingham's primary political role was as the Lord High Admiral, yet his influence extended across a broad spectrum of foreign and domestic affairs. His immense pride hindered him from sharing authority with more knowledgeable and seasoned officials. He possessed no capacity for self-criticism and attempted to rectify each new disaster with another equally poorly conceived plan. Buckingham's ascent to power coincided with James's decision to pursue an alliance with Spain through what has become known as the Spanish Match, the marriage of Prince Charles to the Spanish Infanta, Maria Ana. James aimed to secure Spanish support for his Protestant son-in-law Frederick, the Elector Palatine, against the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor. Buckingham himself vacillated between advocating direct military aid to Frederick and supporting the Spanish alliance. In 1623, he accompanied Prince Charles to Madrid on a mission to arrange the marriage between the prince and the daughter of the Spanish king. His plan was to gain favor with the Spanish and form an alliance in a diplomatic fashion. But the marriage negotiations collapsed midstream. Buckingham's enemies claimed the failure was due to Buckingham's bad attitude and lack of diplomatic skills. However, It was just as likely due to the Spaniards' demand that Prince Charles convert to Catholicism and that James repeal the English anti-Catholic laws. Upon returning to England, Buckingham and Charles guided the elderly king toward a pro-French alliance instead and promoted active military campaigns against both the German Catholics and the Catholic Spaniards. In the Parliament of 1624, Buckingham reached the pinnacle of his popularity, as both Parliament and Protestant nobles supported a French alliance resulting in a strained relationship between Buckingham and King James. James, who always favored peace over war, remained steadfast in his pursuit of peace through marriage with the Infanta. Increasingly, James found himself isolated from the running of his own country, as Charles along with Buckingham gained momentum in promoting their war agenda. The king's mental and emotional stability began to deteriorate, leading him to suspicions of George, who he accused of being more interested in Charles and politics than their relationship. James eventually conceded to support their efforts, but the tension between the king and his courtier persisted, exacerbated by Spanish attempts to sow discord between them via the Spanish ambassador to the court known as Gondomar. Their dispute reached a climax during a public argument while in the royal coach, culminating in tears by both men and James leaving George stranded on the side of the road. By May 1624, James was convinced that the relationship was over, feeling desolate and abandoned, but they were unexpectedly reunited when George fell dangerously ill. James set aside their differences to personally nurse the man he loved back to health. Upon his full recovery, Buckingham returned to court, visibly weakened but once again in favor with the king. Their bond grew stronger, evidenced by the dismissal of the Spanish ambassador Gondomar. Efforts for war with Spain and a royal marriage alliance with France continued as Buckingham joined forces once again with Prince Charles. But in March of 1625, a 70-year-old King James fell seriously ill. Over the course of his life, the king had suffered from various health issues including itchy skin, arthritis, gout, and abdominal pain. Based on his symptoms, medical historians have assigned to James the royal disease of porphyria, an inherited affliction of the nervous system and skin linked to unusual behavior. One source states, "It is generally agreed that the last 5 years of King James I's life were accompanied by intellectual deterioration." The king's chief physician was out of the country and unable to attend the ailing monarch, when Buckingham determined that he would intervene. He gathered a group of 8 individuals, including doctors, alchemists, and others loosely considered medical practitioners to attend the king. Buckingham's mother also insisted she be involved in the king's treatment. Some members of the court objected to these individuals not being officially sworn into the king's service, and thus deemed unfit to treat royalty. However, James trusted George and allowed their involvement. The significant issue was not just the lack of official status for some of these individuals, but also the absence of a sustained, clear, or consistent treatment plan. The group designed treatments based on their observations without consulting each other. George administered a daily potion to James and dismissed protesting doctors. Mary treated him with plasters, which also raised objections, but Prince Charles instructed the doctors to let them proceed. Ointments and treatments were given without any knowledge of what the king had already been given. 2 weeks later, James's condition deteriorated rapidly. He accused George of trying to murder him with the potion, but this was dismissed as a delusion. On March 27, 1625, King James I passed away with his beloved courtier, George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, by his side. Almost immediately, Buckingham's enemies accused him of poisoning the king. A parliamentary investigation was launched, and scurrilous pamphlets and ballads circulated London streets, but the charges came to nothing and were relegated to a historical footnote. For years, historians have cast doubt on the suspicion that Buckingham poisoned King James, with some clearing him of the charge entirely. But more recently, author Benjamin Woolley, who published The King's Assassin in 2018, is not so quick to dismiss the accusation. He writes that a fatal mix of arrogance and susceptibility quite possibly motivated George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, to commit regicide. It might have been accidental, a result of administering a dubious remedy while the king was debilitated by malaria. However, there is compelling evidence suggesting that Villiers, driven by ambition and discontent with James's passive governance, deliberately poisoned him. Woolley's book, adapted to the 2024 historical drama entitled Mary and George, lays out the case for the murder of King James by George along with his mother, Mary Villiers. The miniseries also leaves no doubt of the sexual nature of George and James's relationship. After the death of King James, George remained at court under the favor of King Charles I. Charles initially maintained a close relationship with Buckingham based on his friendship with Villiers during James's reign, and he continued to trust him as an advisor. However, their relationship wasn't without strain. Public opinion towards Buckingham remained fiercely negative. Many blamed him for past political and military failures, not to mention the suspicions of his involvement in King James' death. Charles, too, was being drawn into those suspicions, which threatened to negatively impact Charles's own position. Over time, Charles gradually distanced himself from Buckingham, perhaps due to public pressure or a recognition of Buckingham's limitations as an advisor. George Villiers, first Duke of Buckingham, met a violent end at the age of 35 on August 23, 1628, at the Greyhound Inn in Portsmouth, England. Buckingham was there on military business, organizing another expedition. His killer was a disgruntled soldier named John Felton, a lieutenant in the English army who plunged a knife into Buckingham's back. Various reasons of a personal nature have been suggested for the murder, but it cannot be overlooked that Felton may have seen himself a patriot loyal to king and country. Buckingham was a deeply unpopular figure. The public blamed him for a string of military failures and political troubles. A document called the Remonstrance by Parliament listed grievances against Buckingham, which Felton likely read. This document may have convinced him that killing Buckingham was an act of patriotism, a way to rid the nation of a corrupt leader. Whatever the reason, Felton didn't even try to escape. He was quickly apprehended, tried, and found guilty of treason. By this time, Buckingham had become so unpopular that Felton was hailed as a hero by the public. Numerous poems were published praising Felton and justifying his actions. Written statements carried by Felton in his hat during the assassination were also widely circulated. Many of these portrayed Buckingham as effeminate, cowardly, and corrupt, contrasting him with Felton, who was depicted as a paragon of manliness, courage, and virtue. John Felton was hanged at Tyburn on November 29, 1628. George Villiers, first Duke of Buckingham, died in the prime of his life at the age of 36. His body was laid to rest in the King Henry VII Chapel at Westminster Abbey, a place typically reserved for royalty. There, beneath a reclining bronze effigy, his body now rests near the tomb of his beloved King James. A tablet facing the tomb bears the famous Latin inscription describing him as the enigma of the world. Mary Villiers, Countess of Buckingham, mother of George Villiers, lived another 4 years after the death of her son, the man who won the heart of King James VI of Scotland and the First of England. She was a woman of formidable strength of character, described by contemporary historians as possessing relentless ambition and greed while also behaving as cold and tactless at court. Upon the assassination of her son George, it was said that she reacted to the news without any sign of surprise, as though it was something she had long expected. She died on April 19, 1632, and is entombed in what is considered a magnificent white marble monument, with effigies of her and her husband, Sir George Villiers, in the Chapel of St. Nicholas in Westminster Abbey. What do you think about King James I and his male courtiers? Were they physically intimate with the king, or was it just an emotional connection that served the king's need for companionship? And would you say that King James was gay as we would view it in today's world? Let us know in the comments, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.